The last thing I remember clearly from that departure terminal is the sound of my suitcase wheels on the cold marble floor, and then silence. Not the silence of an empty airport, but the silence of someone who has just realized she is completely alone in a crowd of thousands. My flight to Hawaii was supposed to leave in 40 minutes. I had my boarding pass. I had my passport. I had spent 11 months saving, planning, and dreaming about this trip, our family's first real vacation in 16 years. But my daughter-in-law, Diana, stood at gate 12 with my son Marcus beside her, and she looked me dead in the eye and said, "We decided you're not coming." Let me take you back to where this all started, because what happened that day at the airport was not a spontaneous argument. It was the final act of a plan that had been building quietly, right under my nose, for nearly 2 years. My name is Emily. I am 63 years old. I raised my son on my own. I worked 2 jobs for most of my life, and I truly believed that family was the one thing you could always count on. I was wrong, but here is what I also know. The moment they left me standing at that gate was the moment my real life finally began. My son Marcus was born on a Tuesday in October, 34 years ago. I remember the exact weight of him in my arms, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the entire world. I was 29 years old, recently separated from his father, and completely terrified. But I looked right back at that tiny face, and I made him a promise. I told him, "I will never leave you behind." I kept that promise for 34 years. I worked as a hospital administrator for most of Marcus's childhood. The hours were long, the pay was modest, and there were many evenings I came home to a dark apartment and reheated whatever I had left in the refrigerator from 2 days before. But Marcus always had his school clothes pressed. He always had his lunch packed. He never once had to sit in an after-school program waiting for a parent who didn't show up. When Marcus was 12, his father remarried and moved to another state. Marcus cried about it for about a week. And then he squared his little shoulders and said, "It's okay, Mom. It's just us." And I remember smiling at him, this fierce, brave 12-year-old, and thinking, yes, it's just us. And we are enough. By the time Marcus turned 25, he had his own apartment, a steady job as a project manager at a construction firm, and a girlfriend named Diana, who worked in marketing. Diana was beautiful in the way that makes you a little nervous, polished, always perfectly put together, with a smile that arrived just slightly later than her eyes. But she seemed to make Marcus happy, and that was all I ever asked for. They married 3 years later on a warm Saturday in June. I wore my mother's pearl earrings. I cried during the ceremony. I danced with Marcus at the reception until my feet ached. Looking back, I should have noticed when Diana started answering questions that were directed at me. Small things at first. Marcus would ask if I wanted more wine at dinner, and Diana would say, "She's fine," before I could open my mouth. I should have noticed when the Sunday dinners I used to host started feeling like visits I needed to schedule in advance with Diana's approval. I should have noticed when my key to Marcus's house, the key he'd given me when they first moved in together, disappeared from his hook one afternoon and was never mentioned again. But I loved my son, and I trusted him, and so I explained each small thing away. The Hawaii trip was Marcus's idea. Or at least that's what he told me. It was Thanksgiving dinner, and we were seated around the table at Diana's parents' house. A large, drafty home in the suburbs that always smelled faintly of fresh paint, as though someone was perpetually renovating something. Diana's parents, Frank and Loretta, were pleasant enough people who had strong opinions about everything from politics to what kind of soy sauce belongs in a stir-fry. I had learned over the years to smile and listen. Marcus stood up during dessert and announced that he had been saving up, and that he wanted to take the whole family to Maui the following August. He was beaming. He looked exactly like he had at 12 years old, proud of himself, wanting to share something good. Whole family, He said, "Means you too, Mom." I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. What I did not see, because I was looking at Marcus, was the expression on Diana's face. Her sister told me about it later. Diana's face apparently went completely still, not upset, not happy. Just very, very still. The next 8 months were a slow education in a particular kind of cruelty, the kind that disguises itself as consideration. Diana texted me the flight information, she sent me the hotel details, she asked me about my dietary restrictions and whether I needed a wheelchair assistance request at the airport. Every few weeks, she would send a cheerful message getting excited for Hawaii, or only 90 days, and I would feel that warmth again and think, maybe I had been too hard on her. Maybe things were different now. Maybe family was settling into something real. It was exactly 9:14 a.m. on the Thursday before our Saturday departure when the phone rang. It was Marcus. He said, "Mom, there might be a small issue with the booking." I sat down at my kitchen table. I had my blue ceramic teapot in front of me, and I remember wrapping both hands around it, the way you do when you need something solid. "What kind of issue?" I said. "Diana's going to explain." He said, and I want you to really hear this. He handed the phone to his wife rather than explaining something himself. To his own mother, he handed the phone to his wife. Diana's voice was composed, almost gentle. She explained that there had been a rebooking, that the airline had changed some things, and that there were now only 4 seats on the original flight. Herself, Marcus, and Diana's parents, Frank and Loretta. "But," she said, "there's a later flight you could take, same day. You'd get to Maui, just about 4 hours after us." I said, "Diana, why are Diana's parents on this trip?" Marcus said, "Family." There was a pause. "They are family," she said, "and they've been helping us with the down payment on the house, so we wanted to include them this time." I sat with that for a long moment. I said, "All right, send me the information for the later flight." She said she would. She never did. I called Marcus back at 6 p.m. that evening. No answer. I texted. No reply. I tried again at 8 p.m. Nothing. Friday, the day before our flight, I drove to their house. Diana's car was in the driveway. Marcus's truck was gone, which meant he was at work. I rang the doorbell. Diana answered in her Saturday clothes on a Friday morning, which meant she was not going to her office that day. She had a cup of coffee in one hand, and she looked at me the way you look at someone who has arrived unexpectedly and inconveniently. "Emily," she said, "I was going to call you." I said, "You didn't send me the flight information." She stepped aside and let me into the entryway. Not into the living room, the entryway, as though I might not be staying. She said that she had looked at the alternative flight, and the timing didn't really work, and that she thought perhaps it would be better if I just sat this trip out, and they would plan something else for me later. I said, "Diana, Marcus invited me. This is my son's trip." She looked at me with a particular kind of patience, the kind that is its own form of condescension, and she said, "Emily, between you and us, this trip is really for my parents. They've been going through a difficult year. Frank's had some health issues. We wanted to give them something special, and honestly, you can be a lot sometimes." I felt my hands go cold. I want you to understand something about what it feels like to hear those words from the woman who married your child. You can be a lot sometimes, after 34 years of being everything, after every school play and every sick night and every dollar stretched until it was thin as paper. To be told in an entryway that you are a lot. I said quietly, "Does Marcus know you're saying this to me?" She said, "Marcus and I are on the same page." I drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for 22 minutes, and then I walked inside, opened my suitcase, which was already packed, and I made a decision. I was going to Hawaii. I had paid for my own flight. My name was on that original reservation. I had my boarding pass on my phone. And no one, not Diana, not anyone was going to tell me I was too much for my own life. Saturday morning, I arrived at the airport at 5:30 a.m., 2 hours before boarding. My flight was at 7:45. I wore my comfortable traveling clothes, my navy blue linen pants, and the cream blouse Marcus had given me 2 Christmases ago. I found them at gate 12 at 6:20. Marcus was on his phone. Diana was applying hand cream. Frank and Loretta were sharing a cinnamon roll from one of the airport bakeries. It looked from a distance like a perfectly normal family morning. And then Diana looked up and saw me. The change in her expression was so swift and complete that Frank actually turned around to see what she was looking at. Marcus looked up from his phone. His face did something complicated. I walked toward them calmly. I said, "Good morning." Marcus said, "Mom, what are you?" And then he stopped. Diana stepped forward, and this is the part that I have replayed more times than I can count. She did not whisper. She did not pull me aside. She said, in a voice loud enough for the people at the adjacent gate to hear, "Emily, I told you this isn't going to work. You need to go home." I said, "I have a boarding pass. I'm on this flight." She said, "Marcus, handle this." And my son who I had carried and raised and sacrificed for, and loved every single day of his life, looked at me and said, "Mom, maybe Diana's right. Maybe it's better if you don't come." I stood there, silent. I looked at him for a long moment. And I understood, perhaps for the first time with complete clarity, that the man standing in front of me was not the 12-year-old who had said, "It's just us." He had become someone else's. And he had chosen to be, I said very calmly, "All right, Marcus, I'll remember this." And I watched them board the plane. I sat in a chair at gate 12 for 45 minutes after the doors closed, and then I did something that no one in that airport, and certainly not Diana, could have predicted. I called my accountant. Here is what Diana did not know about me, and what Marcus, in his comfortable new life, had perhaps forgotten. I had spent 30 years in hospital administration. By the time I retired at 62, I was managing a budget of $12 million annually. I understood contracts, I understood documentation, and I understood very well how money works and who it belongs to. 3 years earlier, when Marcus and Diana had been looking to buy their house, they had come to me with a problem. They were short on their down payment. Diana's parents had contributed $50,000, but they still needed $40,000 more. I had given Marcus $40,000 from my retirement savings, not as a loan formally. Marcus had said, "Mom, we'll pay you back." I had said, "Don't worry about it," and I had meant it. What I had not done was document it in any way. Diana knew this. I believe, sitting in that airport, that she had always known this. The money I gave Marcus had never been discussed as a debt. It had never been acknowledged beyond a brief thank you text. And in Diana's calculation, because I understand now that Diana had calculations, undocumented money given to a son is not a debt to his mother. It is simply a gift that disappears. But here is what else I had done 3 years ago, which Diana did not know. 2 weeks after, I gave Marcus the $40,000 after a quiet conversation with my attorney that I had not shared with anyone. I had updated my will. And I had drafted a document witnessed and notarized that described the $40,000 as a personal loan, with terms to be determined at my discretion. My attorney had advised me to do this. Not because I distrusted Marcus at the time, I didn't, but because she had told me gently that family financial arrangements without documentation become family disputes. I had filed the document and forgotten about it, or rather, I had hoped I would never need it. Sitting at gate 12, I called my accountant. I said, "I need you to find the loan document for my son, and I need you to call my attorney." My accountant, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who has known me for 15 years, said, "Emily, are you all right?" I said, "I'm going to be." But the financial document was only one part of what I was beginning to understand. When I got home from the airport that day, driving myself, calm as a clear morning, I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat down at my desk with my laptop. I had access to an email account that Marcus had set up for me years ago, connected through a shared family plan. I had never paid much attention to it, but when I opened it that afternoon, I noticed something. A forwarding filter had been set on my account. Someone and I had a strong suspicion who had set it so that certain emails sent to me were being quietly forwarded to another address. Emails from my doctor's office, emails from my financial institution, even, it seemed, emails from the travel company we had used to book the Hawaii trip. I am not a technology expert, but I know what it looks like when someone has decided to monitor you. I called my nephew Daniel, who works in IT security. I asked him to come over. He spent 2 hours at my computer. When he was done, he showed me the filter, and he showed me the forwarding address, Diana Hartley, personal at an email I had never seen before. He said, "Aunt Emily, this is not okay. This is potentially illegal." I said, "How long?" He said, based on the timestamp on the filter, it had been active for 14 months. I sat with that number, 14 months. Diana had been reading my emails, or at least certain categories of them, for more than a year, while sending me cheerful texts about Hawaii, while asking me about my dietary restrictions. I thought about what she might have been looking for. Financial information, health information, evidence of what I had, and what I was planning to do with it. I thought about my will. I called my attorney. My attorney's name is Sandra, and she has the kind of calm competence that makes difficult conversations feel manageable. I have worked with her for 20 years, since the early days of my career when I needed help negotiating a hospital contract. I explained everything: the airport, the email filter, the loan document, the $40,000. Sandra listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Emily, I want to ask you something directly. What do you want to happen here?" I thought about it carefully. I thought about Marcus at the airport, saying maybe Diana's right. I thought about Diana's voice, loud enough for strangers to hear. I thought about 14 months of forwarded emails. I said, I want the money back, and I want the filter removed and documented, and I want my son to understand what his wife has been doing. Sandra said, "We can make all of that happen, but I want to prepare you. Once we start this process, things will change, permanently, possibly." I said, "Sandra, things already changed at 7:45 a.m. on a Saturday." She said, "All right, let's start with the loan." The loan document, Sandra explained, was valid and enforceable. It identified the $40,000 as a personal loan from me to Marcus, with terms at my discretion. Sandra would draft a formal repayment demand, politely worded, legally specific, and we would give Marcus 60 days to respond. The email filter was a separate matter. Sandra connected me with a colleague who handled privacy law. That colleague was interested, very interested, in the forwarding address and the 14-month timeline. I also, during those first 2 weeks after the airport, made 3 other quiet changes. I updated my will. My estate, which includes my house, my retirement accounts, and various other assets, had previously designated Marcus as my primary beneficiary. I changed that. I established a charitable trust and named 3 organizations I care about deeply as the primary recipients of my estate. Marcus remained in the will, but his portion was reduced significantly, and it included a clause specifying that it was contingent on certain conditions being met. I called my financial institution and moved my accounts, and I had Daniel, my IT nephew, remove the email filter and change every password I had. While Diana was in Maui, taking photographs of herself in a floral dress with the ocean behind her, I saw them on social media. I was 3 steps ahead. Marcus called on the 4th day of the trip. I did not answer. He called again on day 5. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was brief and slightly awkward. "Mom, just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. No apology." No acknowledgement of what had happened. Diana texted on day 6. Emily, I hope you're not still upset. We should all sit down when we're back and clear the air. Family is important to us. I read that message twice. Family is important to us, coming from the woman who had told me in an airport to go home. I did not reply. They returned on a Wednesday. Marcus called that evening. This time I answered. He said, Mom, I think we need to talk about what happened. I said, yes, we do. He said, Diana feels like you overreacted. I said, Marcus, I want you to come over tomorrow, alone. There are some things I need to show you. There was a pause. I could hear Diana in the background, a low murmur I couldn't make out. Then Marcus said, Diana thinks it would be better if we all talked together. I said, I'm not asking Diana, I'm asking you. Come tomorrow afternoon, just you. There's something important you need to know. Another pause. Then, okay, Mom, I'll come. I stayed up late that night, organizing documents, the loan paperwork, the IT report from Daniel about the email filter, a printout from Sandra outlining the legal situation. I arranged them in a neat stack on my kitchen table, beside my blue ceramic teapot, and I went to bed and slept better than I had in months. Marcus arrived the following afternoon at 2 p.m. He was wearing a new shirt, something he'd probably bought on the trip, and he looked tanned and a little uncomfortable, the way people look when they know a conversation is coming that they would rather avoid. I made tea. I put out 2 cups. I sat him down at the kitchen table, and I slid the stack of documents across to him. I said, start with the one on top. The first document was Daniel's IT report. It detailed the email forwarding filter when it was created, what categories of email had been redirected, and the destination address, Diana. Hotly personal. I watched Marcus read it. His tan seemed to fade slightly. He said, this could be a mistake. I said, it's documented and time-stamped. Read the next one. The next document was Sandra's summary of the loan, the $40,000, the formal repayment demand. Marcus put the paper down. He said, Mom, this money was, you said. I said, don't worry about it, which is different from saying it was a gift, and I have a notarized document from 3 years ago that describes it as a loan. Sandra will be sending the formal request to your home address by Friday. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Outside, someone in the neighborhood was mowing their lawn. The sound of it was very ordinary against the weight of what was sitting on my kitchen table. Finally, he said, did Diana know about this document? I said, I don't know what Diana knew, but she spent 14 months reading certain categories of my emails, which might tell us something about what she was looking for. Something shifted in Marcus's face, something I recognized not from the man he had become, but from the boy he used to be. A kind of dawning, painful understanding. He said quietly, Mom, I'm sorry. I said, I know. He said, I didn't know about the emails. I said, I believe you, and I did. I believed that Marcus had not known, but I also believed that Marcus had allowed a situation to develop in his home where this was possible, where his wife felt entitled to monitor his mother, where a grown man handed the phone to his wife rather than speak to his own mother directly. Those were not Diana's failures alone, those were his. I said, Marcus, what happens next is going to be uncomfortable. Sandra has already been in touch with a privacy attorney. There may be consequences for Diana, and you are going to need to decide what kind of man you want to be. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't defend Diana. He just nodded. He left at 4 p.m. He called me that evening to say that he had spoken to Diana and that she was very upset. I said, I imagine she is. He said, she says the email thing was a misunderstanding. I said, have your attorney call Sandra. Little did they know, everything was already in motion. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of quiet storm. Diana called me twice. The first call was angry, clipped sentences, words like overblown and vindictive, and this is not how family operates. I listened calmly for about 90 seconds, and then I said, Diana, this is now a legal matter. Please communicate through Sandra. And I hung up. The second call, 2 weeks later, was different. Her voice had that specific quality of someone who has recently spoken to an attorney and discovered that the situation is worse than they thought. She was not soft exactly. Diana was not built for softness, but she was careful. She said something about finding a resolution. She mentioned that she and Marcus had been reflecting. I said the same thing. This is now a legal matter. Please communicate through Sandra. Meanwhile, Diana's parents, Frank and Loretta, had apparently been told some version of events, Diana's version, naturally. Loretta sent me an email which now went safely only to me, that was full of phrases like perspective and give her the benefit of the doubt. I did not reply. What I did do during those weeks was something I had not done in a long time. I called my own friends. My college friend Miriam, who lives 2 states away and who has always given me honest counsel. My neighbor Paulette, who had quietly watched Diana's behavior over the years with a knowing expression she had never quite put into words. My former colleague Ruth, who was in hospital administration beside me for 20 years and who has the kind of clear-eyed practicality I have always admired. I told each of them what had happened, not looking for validation exactly, but needing the reminder that I was not crazy, that the things I had observed and felt and finally acted on were real. Miriam said, "Emily, you gave that woman 14 months and $40,000 and a key to your son. Don't you dare apologize for standing up." Paulette said, "I always knew something was off. I never said anything because it wasn't my place, but I'm saying it now." Ruth said simply, "What do you need?" And what I told Ruth was what I was beginning to understand with more and more clarity. I needed nothing. I had everything I needed. I had my house, my savings, my health, my friends, and a very good attorney. Everything was already in motion. The meeting was in 2 weeks, and they had no idea what was coming. The formal meeting was held in Sandra's conference room on a Tuesday morning in October. Present were Sandra and myself on one side of the table, and Marcus, Diana, and their attorney, a young man named Garrett, who looked slightly overmatched, on the other. Diana had dressed carefully. She wore a structured blazer in charcoal gray, and she sat with her hands folded on the table in a way that suggested she had practiced appearing composed. Marcus sat beside her. He looked tired in a way that went beyond sleep. Sandra opened by laying out 3 items on the table. The loan document, the IT report, and a letter from the privacy attorney outlining Diana's potential liability for the unauthorized email access, which he had concluded could constitute a violation of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. I watched Diana's face as Garrett read the privacy letter. That very particular stillness I had heard about from her sister at the Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, I saw it now for myself. She said, "This is an extreme response to a family misunderstanding." Sandra said pleasantly, "The law doesn't distinguish between family and non-family in matters of unauthorized communications access. Shall we move to the loan discussion?" The loan repayment demand was for the $40,000 plus 3 years of interest at the applicable rate, which brought the total to approximately $46,000. Garrett argued that the money had been given as a gift. Sandra produced the notarized document. Garrett reviewed it quietly. He looked at Diana. She looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the table. There was a long silence. Then Diana said something that I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, leaning forward slightly, her voice finding that careful softness again, "Emily, you're his mother. Is this really how you want things to be between us over money?" I looked at her across that conference table, and I felt, and I want to be honest about this, nothing that resembled anger. I felt something closer to a very deep, very settled clarity. I said, "Diana, you told me I was a lot and sent me home from an airport. You read my private emails for 14 months. You placed yourself between me and my son in ways that weren't yours to decide. So yes, this is how things are." She sat back, Sandra said, "Shall we discuss the repayment schedule?" By the end of that 2-hour meeting, Marcus and Diana agreed to repay the $46,000 in structured installments over 24 months. Sandra drafted the agreement on the spot. The privacy attorney's letter had been enough. No formal complaint would be filed as long as Diana provided a written acknowledgement that the filter had been placed and a commitment to destroy any copies of intercepted communications. Diana signed the acknowledgement with a pen that I noticed had stopped moving once, as though her hand resisted. Then it kept going. Marcus signed the loan agreement. He didn't look at me while he did it. After the meeting in the parking lot, he found me beside my car. Diana had gone ahead with Garrett. Marcus stood in front of me, looking older than 34 in the October light. He said, "I should have handled things differently, a lot of things." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry I didn't say that at the airport." I said, "I know, Marcus." He said, Is there a way back from here?" I thought about that for a moment, about the 12-year-old with his squared shoulders, about the phone handed off to Diana, about gate 12. I said, "There might be, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take you being honest with yourself about what you allowed to happen. Not just what Diana did, what you allowed." He nodded. His eyes were wet. I said, "Call me when you're ready to have that conversation. I'll answer." And I got in my car and I drove home. In the months after that meeting in Sandra's conference room, the shape of things became clearer. Marcus and Diana made their first loan installment in November. They made the second in December. Diana sent me a brief email in January through normal channels to my normal address that consisted of 3 sentences. The first acknowledged that she had overstepped boundaries. The second said she hoped we could eventually move forward. The third wished me a happy new year. It was the most careful minimum possible acknowledgement she could have written, but she wrote it. I replied with 2 sentences, "Thank you for writing. I hope the new year treats you well." Frank and Loretta, Diana's parents, reached out to me separately. Loretta had learned more of the truth by then. From Diana herself, I think, because sometimes people confess things when they're frightened. Loretta was embarrassed. She called and spoke to me for 20 minutes in that rambling way that embarrassed people sometimes do, circling around an apology without quite landing on it. I was kind to her. It wasn't her fault. My neighbor Paulette organized a small gathering for me in February, just 6 women. Dinner at her house, wine, good food, and the kind of conversation that reminds you that you are not alone in the world. She had told the others only the broad outlines, but they all seemed to understand the specific exhaustion of being made to feel like too much by people who needed you to be less. My friend Miriam flew in to visit in March. We went to a botanical garden that I had been meaning to visit for years and never had. We walked through an entire greenhouse full of orchids, and we talked about everything and nothing, the way old friends do. I realized, walking among those flowers, that I felt lighter than I had in a long time, perhaps longer than I had known. As for the will, I did not change it back. Marcus remains in it, as I said, with conditions. Those conditions are mine to set, and they exist not as punishment, but as clarity. I spent too many years being unclear, being generous in ways that were not acknowledged, giving in ways that were not seen. Whatever comes next between Marcus and me will be built on honesty, or it will not be built at all. At Christmas, our first since the airport, Marcus came to my house alone. Without Diana, he sat at my kitchen table and we had coffee and he talked about his work and I talked about the orchid greenhouse and we did not talk about any of it directly. But we talked, and that was something. There is a kind of grief I have come to understand that does not announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive in a single devastating moment. It comes slowly, in the accumulation of small moments when you realize that the people you love have been seeing you differently than you have been seeing yourself. When you understand that you have been grateful for crumbs and calling them a feast. I spent 34 years being the kind of mother who never asked for much, who absorbed difficulty quietly, who told herself that keeping the peace was a form of love. I learned something in that airport, though. Standing alone at gate 12 with my boarding pass in my hand and my son on the other side of the door, I learned that silence is not the same as acceptance, that dignity is not the same as submission, and that standing up calmly, legally, completely is not the opposite of love. It is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, because it forces the people who love you to see you clearly. My son is learning to see me clearly. It is a slow and sometimes painful process, but he is learning. Diana, I don't know what Diana is learning. That is her work to do, and I have decided to leave her to it. I have no hatred for her. What she did was wrong, and the consequences were fair, and that is where I leave it. What I know is this: I booked myself a trip to Hawaii in April, alone. I stayed at a small hotel on the North Shore that had an ocean view and a LAN, where I drank my morning tea and watched the sun come up over the water. I rented a car and drove along roads lined with plumeria trees, and I went to a farmer's market, and I bought papaya and macadamia nuts and ate them sitting on a bench like someone with nowhere to be. And all the time in the world, I was not alone in any way that mattered. I had myself. I had everything I needed. If you are listening to this and any part of it sounds familiar, if you have felt that particular chill of realizing you are being managed rather than loved, if you have been told in some form that you are too much by the people who should need you most, then I want to say something directly to you. You are not too much, you are precisely enough. The problem is never that you are too much. The problem is that some people need you to be less so that they can feel like more. I learned, later in life than I would have wished, that love does not require you to make yourself smaller. That generosity does not obligate you to silence, that the dignity you carry, the one you have built across years and decades of quiet work and sacrifice, belongs to you. No one can take it unless you hand it over. I also learned that justice does not require drama. It requires clarity and patience and a very good attorney. Document things, update your will. Know what you have and what you are owed. Not because family should be a transaction, but because people who love you should not need the documentation to treat you well, and people who do not love you well should not be able to pretend that undocumented kindness never happened. Take the trip, go to Hawaii, drink your tea on the lanai. Watch the sun rise over the water. You have earned it. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear about your experiences in the comments. We are none of us as alone as we feel in the hard moments, and I believe deeply that our stories, when we tell them, become lights for other people finding their way. My name is Emily. Thank you for listening, and remember, every story has a lesson, and yours might be just beginning.